Before today's ship chat, I'd like to give a shout out to all my channel members who are supporting me in making this content. If you would like to support the channel, you can become a member and click the join button. You'll also get access to all sorts of exclusive perks, including the Discord server, on which I will be hosting monthly Q&A sessions after each episode of Battlespace or Wings. Thank you so very much. Right, today we're going to be taking a look at the Curry class, and it's really quite a controversial class. It's probably one of the most controversial ships outside of New Trek, which is quite impressive, really. It really is quite like Marmite. It really is quite a peculiar ship, and it has quite a peculiar story. Real life origins. It was, of course, designed as a background model for Deep Space Nine for the Dominion War arc. Now, I should make clear, actually, there are two models, and a lot of people don't seem to realise this. There's actually two. There's the Raging Queen, which is further in the background, and it has its nacelles mounted on sideways. The warp field grills aren't facing each other. So that's one, and then the other one is, of course, the Curry, which is featured much more in the foreground, which has the nacelles and the traditional upright positioning. But aside from that, they're largely similar, and they're both background models that were badly beaten and boshed up, and they were, of course, hastily kit-bashed together by Dan Curry, which is who the Curry is actually named after. He was the VFX supervisor. But as part of the kit-bashing process, they put together, obviously, the parts of, we think, an Excelsior kit, and we also think a Miranda kit. It might have been a Constitution kit, but more likely it was a Miranda kit. And there was a real problem with that, because the two kits are actually on different scales, which is why you can see in these models that the nacelles are absurdly large, certainly if you were to scale them. So you come to a real scale problem. And that is, by what metric do you set the scale? Do you scale it according to its Constitution nacelles? It would be only 174 meters, which is tiny, absolutely tiny, completely useless. Or do you scale it more to its Excelsior parts, which would give it an overall length of 354 meters? There's one of the debates. Another thing that I've seen done to reconcile this problem is just swap it out with Excelsior nacelles. Although at that point, why didn't they just build an Excelsior? At least having the mismatched nacelles and hull kind of makes sense as to why it isn't laid out in a conventional way. I personally would go for the 354 meters for it to be frankly of any use. Otherwise, it really is just a useless bit of set dressing. It's probably only good as a tug, really, and I think we see it being pulled by a tug, so there you have it. Aside from that, other background information we have is that they were going to throw away at least the Raging Queen. They were just going to throw them out because they were one-off models. But they were saved by Gary Herzl, which is how we have the information on it that we do today, which is very, very handy. But that's its real-life story and the issues around the design. In universe, there isn't really a specific idea or concept that forms for the Curry. It wasn't specifically designed necessarily, it was just bodged together in order to accomplish a task, and that task was that of carrying fighters. You see, in the Maquis campaigns had begun to demonstrate the effectiveness of fighters, large numbers of fighters, swarming enemy starships. Now, the Cardassians adapted and they improved their tactics, and there's a whole tangent I could go on about the role of fighters and the tactics. But the Federation conclude that having a fighter capacity could be somewhat important and has proven itself in use, at least on a small scale. And then during the second Borg invasion, they take a lot of losses. And they also decide that using fighters, particularly against the Borg, would be quite effective. They're very small and individually quite difficult to isolate and destroy, and even if you do, you only take out one or two people. It's actually quite a good way of combating the Borg, or at least keeping them occupied. And so the Curry class is basically developed subsequent to that and just makes use of the two most available components, which are Excelsior hulls, presumably the ones that got left over from the construction of Centaurs, and Constitution refit nacelles. So just take those off of the old Constitutions, and if you don't want to build a new Miranda, which you maybe don't, because actually other ships are going to come in to replace the Miranda. So those are the most available components, and they just bodge them together in order to create the Curry class. Now, it is quite a peculiar layout, but there is a reason for that. But first I'll explain why they called it the Curry class. Like I say, they didn't really plan this thing out. They just kind of bodged it together as quickly as they could. And it was really named by the actual engineers. No one else really was going to bother. So they decided to name them after 20th century cult actors. So each batch would be themed after a specific actor, with the lead ship in the batch being named after the actor themselves, and then the other ships in the batch would be named after some of their most famous characters, hence why you have the Curry as well as the Cherdenko and the Petrov. You also then had subsequent batches such as the Skarsgård batch and the Stormare batch. So that's where the name comes from. Well, I mean, they were building enough ships, so I suppose they had to come up with ever more creative names. Now, I'll get on to why it is laid out the way it is, because it is quite unusual. And that's because they actually changed out where they were placing the reactor. Partially because technology had moved on substantially since the first Excelsior, so you didn't need so much space to accommodate the reactor as you did on the original Excelsior. They had a particular interest in increasing the carrying capacity of the ship. And so what they did was they basically moved the saucer to the back end and connected it via a neck structure to the secondary hull. And through that neck structure is running the new warp core, which is good enough. It's nothing spectacular, but it gets the job done. And what it does is it frees up a huge amount of space where the old engine systems would be located in the front of the secondary hull. You now have all this space freed up, and this is to help the Curry carry out the role for which it was built, and that is to be a fighter carrier. In total, it can carry about 12 Peregrines, as well as some other shuttles, generally older models. The newer shuttles would be launched generally from Akira classes. They would generally get runabouts or whatever else they could really fit in there. Now 12 Peregrines doesn't sound like much. But when the Curry itself is deployed in number, and suddenly 12 Peregrines becomes 48 Peregrines, then you're really looking at something quite effective, and would give anyone pause, really. Now, again, I won't go into the specifics about the Peregrine as a fighter, but it's part of the success of the Curry. In fact, it's largely that in which the Curry is successful. It's frankly pretty useless on its own, really quite unwieldy and not that potent either. But as a support vessel, it really is quite an effective force multiplier and really helps. The fighters really help keep the enemy at bay. And like I say, there's a whole set of tactics and doctrine around the fighters themselves that do actually have a significant impact on the battle space. So actually having these Curry-class ships, even though they themselves in a direct combat role are pretty much useless, their role as a support vessel makes them an impressive force multiplier. Even so, in combat, it's got a handful of phaser arrays and some torpedo tubes, but really nothing in that respect. I suppose it's better than absolutely nothing, but that really could be said for the Curry class. It really is a case of they could build it and it was better than having nothing. But aside from that, as a ship in and of itself, it wasn't particularly impressive. But as like I say, as part of a larger force, as part of a larger fleet, it really did play quite an important role, even if it wasn't stealing glory. So, quite a handy ship in that respect.